Associate Minister of Public Safety Rachel Bendayan is the new face of gun confiscation here in Canada. In her first press conference, she told lie after lie after lie in order to garner political support from the disinformed masses. But what is the actual truth behind what she said? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at the recent gun ban press conference held by the Liberal Party of Canada. If you're looking for the specifics of what that all entails, please check out my previous video where I discussed all of that. I talked about the ban list, the alterations to the amnesty and the new Phase 3 of the confiscation program, as well as the potential upcoming magazine bans. The ban itself focused primarily on the M1 carbine as well as other World War I and II era firearms, so this ban primarily impacted collectors. But there were a few modern additions to the list. So if you want to learn more about that, please go check it out. This video is going to cover the other aspect of the press conference where Bendayan told manipulative lies about how effective these gun bans have been, and so on. This is the first time I've ever really seen Rachel Bendayan do any kind of press conference or public speech on her own. But my oh my, could she give Trudeau and Mendicino a run for their money. Like, the level of dishonesty in her words was just unreal. And the stuff she wanted to blame us law-abiding gun owners for, and the stuff that she tried to take credit for? Hoy, how's something? At the very least, it was rather on brand for the Liberals, if nothing else. But unlike Trudeau and Mendicino, at least I didn't feel like I needed to take a shower after hearing her speak, so that's something, I guess? Of course, she started off with the typical rhetoric, which has become almost generic at this point.
My name is Rachel Bendayan. I'm the Associate Minister of Public Safety and the Minister for Official Languages. Today, our government is finishing the job, adding a further 179 unique makes and models of assault-style weapons to the list of prohibited firearms here in Canada. Let's be clear, these are weapons of war. Firearms designed specifically to kill as many people as possible in the least amount of time possible. The weapons we are banning today are semi-automatic firearms with sustained rapid-fire capability. Experts have told us that they exceed safe civilian use. My top priority is keeping Canadians safe. Firearms meant for the battlefield should never see the light of day on our streets.
But then she went off the rails fast. She started talking about gun violence in America as though her announcement today somehow had anything to do with that.
Canadians are also very well aware of the impact of firearms in the United States, where there they experience about 600 mass shootings per year, nearly 2 per day. And those are mass shootings. In 2022, there were over 48,000 firearm-related deaths in the U.S.
And of course, this is just ridiculous. Canadian firearms regulations have no impact on American gun violence because they're two wholly different conversations and countries. Like, it's a pretty lazy attempt to convince people that more guns automatically means more gun violence. Now, unfortunately, such baseless claims work rather well on the ignorant. People who have no idea about the realities of the situation. Because no realities have ever been explained to them. All they know about the firearm conversation is the lies told to them by the media and by the government. And those lies align with these lies. But if anything, her statement actually proves our point rather well. Canada already has excellent firearm regulations in place to keep Canadians safe. Bendayan pointing out that there are over 600 MCIs per year in the States goes to show just how effective Canada's gun laws already are. And then, she started claiming that the Liberals' gun bans have already worked. That gun crime in Canada is actually going down thanks to their efforts. And then she cited some recently released Statscan article from 2023.
As a result of the various steps we have taken, we've seen a decline in violent crime involving firearms across Canada. Data for 2023 was just recently released by Statistics Canada and shows that this decline was most pronounced in large urban areas.
Which is rather convenient timing, to say the least. I've made videos about this in the past, but the Juristat articles, and therefore also Statistics Canada to some extent, really isn't an independent statistical agency anymore. Even outside the realm of the gun control conversation, it's rather evident that Juristat has been compromised by liberal ideology and rhetoric.
But this does really go to show just how Statscan can be corrupted by politics. Articles kind of in 2010
where the last Conservative Party was in office. You can just take a look at these things. Like, it's about police officers' safety, it's about homicide stats, it's about correctional services, it's about criminal victimization, police stats this, police stats that, and just year after year, it's homicides, it's all these very core statistical, just outright factual information. And it's just year after year, it's all that. We're looking kind of 2-3 years deep now. It's all just this hardcore statistical information. If you go to this year, can you imagine what they were talking about this year? If we go to the first page, it's gender-related issues. It's homicides of Indigenous women. It's discrimination this. It's Indigenous persons that. It's homicide of women and girls this. It's minority group that. Like, it's all this identity politics stuff is what they're focusing on now. And that should be severely concerning to everybody. Not that we shouldn't be looking at those things, but we shouldn't be looking at exclusively those things. There's one article in all of 2023 so far, which would be your sort of broad spectrum analysis of crime as a whole. There's one. But when you look at firearms specifically, this is not the first time that Juristat has released their firearms-related violence articles, full of Liberal talking points, mind you, in direct relation to the announcements of the Liberals' proposed various changes to firearms laws. They did this in lockstep just 3 days before the announcement of Bill C-21, and then again as many C-21 measures were coming into force in January of 2024. And then, of course, just a little over a week before our most recent ban here, Juristat dropped another new article on firearm-related violence, stacked again with Liberal talking points, so that she could have something to talk about. This is also evidenced by the fact that this year's Juristat article is noticeably shorter than other years, with much less diverse breakdowns in the data. And it looks like only the most conveniently beneficial information is being displayed on behalf of the Liberals, and I'm sure that's just a happy coincidence. Well, let's take a look at what she actually said.
With a decrease of violent crime involving guns of 19% in Toronto, a decrease of 12% in Montreal, of 15% in Vancouver, and a decline of 22% in Calgary. Although homicides involving firearms had risen year over year previously, in 2023, the rate dropped by 18%. There were, in fact, 54 fewer firearm-related homicides in Canada in 2023. Reducing the number of guns in circulation helps reduce gun violence.
She said very clearly a 19% decline in Toronto, a decrease of 12% in Montreal, a 15% decline in Vancouver, and a 22% decline in Calgary. And this shows us that she was very clearly citing this paragraph from the Statscan report. While she was accurate regarding all of the other cities, Toronto actually only saw a 9% decline, not a 19% decline as she stated. Now, for what it's worth, I don't think she intentionally lied about that particular point. I mean, maybe she did. But she was up there reading her information live, and to be fair to her, I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt that this was merely some kind of honest mistake. She probably just misread her script in real time. Not that she's done anything to earn such a break, but we don't need to nitpick her in order to expose her. The more important part of her claim here is that all of their efforts are directly and solely responsible for this 9% decline in Toronto. Which is, of course, completely ridiculous. I mean, the premise itself is ridiculous. Gun violence isn't going down in Canada. If you look at the very same article she quotes, the graphs very clearly show an explosion of firearm violence since the Liberals took office in 2015. And all previous firearm-related violent crime articles on Statscan have said as much. And I've demonstrated that repeatedly in many other videos on this channel. So what she's trying to take credit for is this tiny little dip at the end here, and wants to ignore everything else which has been happening over the last decade. But that dip is not statistically significant. That is merely the year-over-year variance. And we know it's not statistically significant for a number of different reasons. It has been well known and well established for years now that nearly 90% of all firearms used in crimes in Toronto can be positively traced back to the United States. Now, that doesn't mean that the remaining 10% are Canadian, because some of these firearms also have unknown origins, but let's be generous and assume that most of them are, let's say, 9% or so. So if she's claiming that the Liberals' measures are solely responsible for this 9% reduction that we saw last year in Toronto, that must mean that the Liberals' measures have resulted in a 100% decrease of the misuse of firearms of Canadian origins. And it must mean that because all of these gun control measures exclusively target Canadian firearms owners. So merely placing a handgun freeze on Canadians and prescribing some firearms as prohibited without actually confiscating them somehow completely solved the Canadian portion of firearm violence in Canada. And even if you believe the lies that the government implemented better border control with the passing of Bill C-21, C-21 didn't actually receive royal assent until halfway through December of 2023. So there's no way any of its measures could have had any time to make any impact on this front in 2023. Also, if they're making the claim that all changes in firearm-related violent crime are the result of their heroic gun control measures, the strongest gun control measures in a generation, in fact, then it must also be logically true that even the negative changes are entirely their fault as well. So, in 2024, when some parts of the Greater Toronto Area had a record-breaking year of gun violence, at least according to the CBC, that also must be the direct result of the Liberals' gun control measures, right? But back to their cherry-picked year of 2023. Bendayan specifically stated that this reduction in firearm-related violent crime was directly the result of them taking lawfully owned firearms out of circulation.
Reducing the number of guns in circulation helps reduce gun violence.
But that claim is, again, ridiculous for reasons that we've already shown, but for another important reason as well. There were actually more firearms in circulation in 2023 than ever before. The Commissioner of Firearms report from 2023 actually confirms this. Being that non-restricted firearms don't require registration, there's no actual real way to confirm how many of them that there are out there. But of the firearms which are registered, and these are primarily handguns, these saw a notable increase in ownership in 2023, not a decrease. We can also assume that non-restricted firearm ownership was up massively as well. Following the first OIC ban in May of 2020, a significant number of non-restricted and restricted rifles became prohibited overnight. However, by the end of 2023, none of these firearms had yet been confiscated, so their numbers had not actually decreased at all. Heck, even to this day, right now in 2025, none of these privately held firearms have been confiscated. So they're all still out there, in the community, stored in the privately owned safes of Canadians. However, most of the people who owned these now prohibited firearms could no longer use them, so they went out and purchased new, non-restricted firearms to replace them. And this is clearly outlined in the graphs as put out by TheGunBlog.ca. This graph shows only the firearm import values instead of any domestic production, but it's enough to really prove the point. As you can clearly see, there is a significant spike in the volume of rifles and shotguns being imported after 2020. This is represented by the blue and orange colors on the graphs. So not only did they not actually reduce the number of firearms in circulation because they hadn't actually confiscated anything yet, but their so-called bans actually led to a dramatic increase in overall firearm sales. So no matter which way you slice it, a reduction in the number of firearms in circulation couldn't have led to a reduction in the firearm-related violent crime because the crime isn't going down and the firearm ownership isn't going down. Bendayan then spouted another common Liberal scare tactic, that these gun bans and new gun laws will help reduce gender-based violence and domestic violence.
Let me walk you through the concrete step that we are taking today to address the use of firearms in situations of domestic violence and gender-based violence. I can announce today that our federal government is moving forward on implementing additional provisions of C-21 to ensure that individuals who are convicted of an offense during which violence was used, threatened, or attempted against their partner or against any member of their family cannot obtain a firearms license. Any request for a license must be refused. Firearms licenses will also be revoked if authorities have grounds to suspect that an act of domestic violence or stalking are taking place.
Now, I've already discussed various Statscan sources in the past on this channel debunking such claims, but the 2023 Commissioner of Firearms report also confirms that this is already a hyper-rare occurrence for licensed individuals. It demonstrates that such occurrences already result in license revocations, indicating that this is in fact not a new measure. This tells us that the new C-21 red and yellow flag laws aren't actually about enabling law enforcement to do things that they couldn't do before, because Canada has had red flag laws stretching all the way back to the late 60s. Tables 7 and 9 of the Commissioner's report confirm that the Canadian Firearms Program already revokes existing licenses and refuses license applications on these grounds. The Firearms Act already states that licenses can be denied or revoked for any good and sufficient reason. And such reasons have always been good and sufficient reasons. So the claim that we needed these new laws or that these new laws are somehow going to help is just not realistic, because Canada has had such laws on the books for over half a century now. What these red and yellow flag laws actually do is reduce or eliminate most of the checks and balances which were put in place to keep the system fair for innocent law-abiding gun owners. So the Liberals cannot claim any kind of statistical correlation between their gun control efforts and positive public safety returns. In fact, all of the evidence, all of it, indicate it either having no impact or that it actually makes Canada a notably more dangerous place. Bendayan only lied in English about the public safety benefits of her gun control for about 10 consecutive minutes, but by the end of it, she very clearly told Canadians why they must do this. And this confirms, once again, on top of an ever-growing mountain of evidence, why the Liberals are manufacturing this wedge issue in the first place. It's never been about public safety. It's always been about politics and generating votes by vilifying innocent Canadians and throwing them under the bus.
Taken together, the measures I am announcing on behalf of the federal government today represent a significant and meaningful step to strengthen gun control in Canada. The safety of women, the safety of all Canadians, is a non-partisan issue. Pierre Poilievre and his Conservative Party have said that they would reverse everything that our government has done to protect Canadians from gun violence, including reversing the important measures we've announced today and over the last many years. I believe that no one is made safer by adding more semi-automatics into our communities, and that is why I am here today. Thank you.
So she stands up and lies about her motivation, lies about the stats, lies about how they're helping, lies about how they're promoting public safety, and then tells us, on a completely unrelated note to be sure, that her political opponents oppose these measures. Yeah, I'm sure that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual motivations behind these measures. And lies like these, at least in my opinion, are dangerously close to hate speech territory. And I don't mean like, oh boo-hoo, the government said some mean things about us on TV. No, I mean the legally enshrined definition of hate speech so far as the Supreme Court of Canada is concerned in the legal precedent established in Whatcott. One very small portion of this test, at least according to Whatcott, is as follows. The courts pose the question of whether, when considered objectively by a reasonable person aware of the relevant context and circumstances, the speech in question would be understood as exposing or tending to expose members of the targeted group to hatred. In the course of this assessment, a judge or adjudicator is expected to put his or her personal views aside and to base the determination on what he or she perceives to be rational views of an informed member of society, viewing the matter realistically and practically. And as I've clearly shown so far in the video, as well as in a great many other videos on this channel, if you're aware of the relevant context and circumstances, it is very evident that these measures proposed by the Liberals are not doing the things that they claim they're doing, and have no ability or even the possibility of doing the things that they claim that they're doing. Yet it very clearly exposes us to hatred and contempt from the public. Like, even if you mistakenly believe that the purpose of these measures is public safety, the effect of these measures is very clearly aimed at destroying firearms owners by placing them in prison. And there is no shortage of people out there who believe that our very existence is what causes gun violence in society. And that must be true. Otherwise, such rhetoric would be very ineffective at creating the wedge issue that the Liberals need in order to generate the votes that they want. And in another court case called Warman versus Cuba, one of the hallmarks of hatred is that the targeted group is blamed for the current problems in society and in the world. Does that sound familiar? The Liberals always say that they understand that the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding and honest folk.
I want to be very clear on this point. The overwhelming majority of gun owners abide by the law.
But that the only way to reduce gun violence is somehow to target us anyway. And this must mean that our minority group is responsible for the gun violence in Canada, and that the only way to solve the gun violence is to target us. We are regularly held responsible not only for the gun violence in Canada, but also, for some reason, for the gun violence in other parts of the world. And this is what we saw Bendayan do when she mentioned the US at the beginning of her press conference.
Canadians are also very well aware of the impact of firearms in the United States, where there they experience about 600 mass shootings per year, nearly 2 per day. And those are mass shootings.
And these are hardly the only 2 points to be made. If you go on to read more about Cuba and Whatcott, they end up reading more like the liberal gun control playbook more than anything. Now, you might say that this is political discourse and therefore it somehow can't amount to hate speech, but Whatcott also very clearly says that political speech is not automatically immune or somehow beyond such scrutiny. And I plan to do a video expanding on that in the future on this channel, as it will need its own videos to really explain it fully. Like, there's all sorts of caveats involving vulnerable groups and protected groups and prohibited grounds of discrimination and all sorts of other nonsense. But I don't think the argument is actually impossible to make. And proving such a thing would be very useful to our minority group if we ever want a permanent legal remedy to this perpetual political persecution. Now, I do want to be very clear here. I am in no way saying that all forms of firearm regulation are somehow equatable to hate speech, as there'd be really no possible way to make that argument. But this particular type of gun control and the rhetoric which creates it, I mean, that should be pretty doable. And if we can demonstrate that point, that would give us a significant step forward at giving us at least Section 15 Charter protections here in Canada. But to do so would also require revolutionizing the idea of what Section 15 ought to mean to the courts. And things start to get real messy real quick when we get to things of that nature. So if you want to learn more about that, and to hear my not a lawyer opinion on such things, please get subscribed and stay tuned. But in a more relatable legal sense, Bendayan also said some interesting things in her press conference which overlapped with topics currently pending a decision from the CCFR's court case at the Federal Court of Appeal. I'm currently most of the way done with my overview of what was said at court, and hopefully that video will be out in the next week or so. But one of the big ticket items discussed at court was the complexity of the current classification system, particularly as how it relates to the undefined use of the word variant. Now, there are a great many issues being caused by this word, but one of the things is that it makes it very difficult to follow the law, even if you're trying your hardest to do so. And at court, the government's lawyers and experts claim that this is really not that big of a deal, and it's really not that hard to know what this undefined word ought to mean, and that even us individual firearm owners should somehow be able to intrinsically know what it means. They say it's obvious what a variant is, even though they are unable and unwilling to define it. Yet we see Bendayan openly agree that these classification systems are becoming too complex and too convoluted for even the firearm industry to be able to follow, let alone us individuals.
Today, our government is announcing the launch of a comprehensive review of the firearms classification regime. The current firearm classification system originated back in the 1960s. Since then, it has become ever increasingly more complex. In fact, we now have one of the most complex systems of firearm classification in the world. This creates challenges for law enforcement, and we've heard that directly from our policing partners. It also creates challenges for lawful gun owners who deserve certainty. I want to be very clear on this point. The overwhelming majority of gun owners abide by the law. But it's become harder and harder for people who want to do the right thing to follow a classification system that is so complex. That is why I've instructed my officials to strengthen these rules so that manufacturers and importers have to wait for the completion of a technical assessment and obtain a reference number before new guns enter the Canadian market.
So despite what the government's lawyers say in court, even the government itself admits this kind of completely arbitrary classification regime creates problems. However, rather than admitting that there's a problem with it, she doubles down and says that the solution to this complexity is to have the RCMP classify firearms on the firearms reference table before they're allowed to enter the market. But that enters into another topic also being broached at the CCFR's court case. Mandating that the RCMP be responsible for firearms classification results in an unlawful subdelegation of authority. The Specialized Firearms Support Service, which runs the firearms reference table, is under the authority of the RCMP. And the RCMP cannot make regulations and cannot make these classification determinations. In court, the government's lawyers try to get around this by saying that these decisions are not truly legally binding, and that these decisions merely reflect the opinion of the Specialized Firearms Support Service. This is already a pretty lousy justification, which I doubt the Federal Court of Appeals wants to buy into. However, if the government mandates that the Specialized Firearms Support Service interpret and apply this word, variant, and make other classification determinations preemptively, then that would no longer be merely just an opinion. They would no longer have any kind of even an implausible deniability, and this should create an unlawful subdelegation of authority. Now, establishing a definition for the word variant could make this a non-interpretive exercise by eliminating all vagueness surrounding the classification system, but the Liberals don't want an inflexible definition for the word variant. They said in court that this word needs to remain undefined so that they can avoid somehow creating loopholes for the firearms industry to exploit. So, make no mistake, this vagueness and complexity which makes the law admittedly difficult to follow, it's all intentional. And lastly, we come to the ever-increasingly blatant hypocrisy of the entire supposed premise behind this form of gun control. The Liberals have long stated and long held that some firearms are designed for military use and that these military firearms are not suitable for civilian use. That banning these firearms is the only way to keep Canadians safe. That these firearms are designed to kill the largest amount of people in the shortest amount of time. That these firearms are unreasonable for hunting and sporting purposes. Over the last few years, we've all heard this nonsense before, and we've all heard it dozens and dozens of times. And it is also something that is a bit of a focal point in the CCFR's court case. Because in order to use the OIC powers to ban a firearm, the Governor and Council must be of the opinion that such a firearm is not reasonable for either hunting or sporting purposes in Canada. So the lie always goes that these so-called assault-style firearms are not reasonable for such purposes, and in Bendayan's press conference we once again see her spout that exact same nonsense, and then she cuts through that lie of her own accord.
Let's be clear, these are weapons of war, firearms designed specifically to kill as many people as possible in the least amount of time possible. Firearms meant for the battlefield should never see the light of day on our streets. In the past, we've seen some firearm models that were designed for military use be later marketed for hunting and civilian use. The SKS, for example, was a firearm designed by the USSR for use in the Second World War. When the war was over, the surplus, of which there was a considerable volume, was dumped at a low price into the Canadian civilian market and marketed for hunting.
You mentioned the SKS. We were told in the technical briefing it is not among the ones that have been prohibited today. Why is that?
The SKS is an example, as I mentioned in my remarks, of a gun that was initially designed for one purpose and then marketed for another. I think the classification review, which I've announced today, will address that in particular. The SKS, of course, is a gun that, as I mentioned, has been used for hunting in Canada, particularly by Indigenous peoples. And in our discussions with Indigenous communities, it was made clear that they are used for sustenance hunting, which is a right that we must respect.
She very specifically and deliberately mentioned that the SKS was a battlefield firearm, but also that it shouldn't be banned because it's still okay for use in hunting. So which is it? The claim is that all battlefield firearms are not suitable for civilian use and they have no place in Canada because they're unreasonable to use for hunting. And then we see her just a few minutes later demonstrating that such firearms are in fact not just suitable, not just appropriate, but completely reasonable for use in hunting by Indigenous communities. That banning these firearms, which are allegedly not suitable for civilian use in hunting, would directly result in citizens not being able to hunt for sustenance. Such a statement not only very clearly demonstrates the reasonability of these so-called assault-style battlefield firearms, but the outright necessity of these firearms for hunting. And this brings us back to another slam dunk on their true motivations. This makes it abundantly clear that this has never been about public safety. These firearms are not any more or any less dangerous in Indigenous hands. But not only that, because firearms which are used for sustenance hunting are already protected under the existing OICs which seek to ban them. The Liberals would be completely able to ban the SKS without affecting Indigenous sustenance hunters if they wanted to. But they don't want to, because banning the SKS would cripple their support politically. It has nothing to do with hunting, it has nothing to do with public safety, it has always been political. And Bendayan put that on full display during her press conference. All that being said, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.